In today's video, I'm going to show you how to make cuffs using the ham-hot method, and then how to attach them to your shirt using the serger with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you're interested to see how I do that, just keep on watching. I'm gonna start off by explaining how to make your cuff. So most patterns tell you how to do it in the regular way, but I like to use the ham-hot method. So pretend that this is fabric and this is the wrong side while the plain is the right side. So a regular instruction will be you fold it right sides together and you sew down this edge. So that's what I've done here on this piece of scrap. So when you have that, it's a tube or a circle and you turn it right sides out, and then you fold it in half this way so that you've made a little cuff. And this works fine, but it is a little finicky, I find, because this is slippery. Like, it doesn't just hold together nicely, and also it's doubly thick because you have two serged seams. It's folded over on itself. So the ham-hot method is this one. So take your same piece of fabric, you fold it right sides together in the same way, but then before you serge down this line, you fold it again, and then you serge here. So what you end up with is this. So then when you turn this right sides out, it is already attached right here, and it's a single thickness serge seam, so it can't slip. So that is the ham-hot method. So I recommend doing that for all cuffs because it just is easier. You have the same cuff, but it's less bulky and less fiddly. Here is my waistband cuff to illustrate how you mark your pins equidistant. So you start with your serged line, the seam, and then lay it flat, and that's where your halfway pin goes. Then you lay it the other way so that your halfway pin is lined up with the serge line. Lay it flat again, and that's where your other two pins go. So now it's marked in quarters. So for the cuffs, I actually only mark it in half because it's smaller and I just find it easier as I'm stretching, especially for really small cuffs. This is an age 5, so they're not teeny. If they were teeny, instead of putting the cuff on the outside of the shirt like this, when the shirt is facing right side out, I would have the shirt inside out, and then I would place the cuff inside the sleeve so that they're still right sides together, but the cuff is inside, and that makes it easier to stretch and sew when it's really tiny. So here I have my sleeve pin to the cuff at 2 spots, the serged side and then halfway across. I always put this serged seam lined up with the seam on the sleeve. So on this shirt, it's actually an underarm panel, so there's 2 to choose from. I chose the inner wrist one. So when I pin that on, I start over here at the serged side. Sorry, this is tangled, there we go. And what I want to do is make sure that the shirt seam is folded one way and the cuff seam is folded the other way. So they're lined up perfectly on this line, but it's not super bulky by having them going over each other. Then I stretch like this to make sure that the cuff is stretching, but the shirt is not stretching. The shirt is just becoming not wrinkled. Do you see that near my left hand? So I stretch it like that, and then that's where I drop that pin, which was already resting on the cuff. So I kind of pull it over, and then I can pinch here and slide that in. So now let's go on over to the serger and attach this. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and attach this cuff here. So my 100th subscriber, Sue MM, thank you very much, had a question about how to sew on the cuffs, keeping the fabric aligned and using the knife. They were using it with the knife disengaged and getting fine results, but they were curious how to use the knife when you're doing this. And the answer to that is it depends on your pattern. So for the waves and wild patterns, which is the majority of what I sew, the seam allowance is 1/4 inch, which means that you basically don't want to be cutting anything off with the knife. For other patterns that I enjoy, like rad patterns, the seam allowance is 1/2 inch. So you want to be trimming off about 1/4 inch as you're going. So that being said, I do keep my knife engaged even when I'm using the patterns with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, because I try to trim off either nothing or like just the tiniest little edge. So the way that I do that is I make sure that my knife, I'll have the light off to see better. Let's see. Is that better? To see this little looper here? The way that I know my knife is at its highest point is I watch the looper. So when I'm turning my hand wheel towards myself, I'm watching the looper, and see what I'm watching the needle. It's at its precipice right there. If I keep turning it, see it starts going down, and the knife is also going down. So I want to stop it when it's at its highest, right there. And that allows me to slide my fabric in as deep as possible so that it's lined up next to the knife. Of course, if my seam allowance is 1/2 inch, I want to be starting it in front of the knife so it can be cutting as I go in. So let's see, make sure I'm looking inside. So I like to start just on this side of my seam so that my end piece, I go all the way around and then I come back over the seam and end here. Personal preference. So I'm just going to make sure I have all 3 layers of my fabric right here. And then I'm going to slide it under, making sure that my pin is not getting caught up in the foot. So I'm going to slide it here. Okay. And then let me zoom in. So can you see how this is a little bit wrinkled right there? So as I turn my hand wheel, see the thread is moving a little bit and it's allowing that to be straight. So now my fabric is lined up straight right here along the edge. So I'm gonna drop my needle all the way down. Remember to drop my foot. And now what I've got is my needle is acting as a pin, holding that in place. So now I can kind of pull on this and have it stretched appropriately. So I'll zoom back out. Oops, too far. You see my cat food. So here we go. And what I do is I stretch between my pins. And that's, the pins are marking where I'm stretching between. So here we go. Line this up nice and straight. And I don't want to be stretching too much. I'm just making it so that the cuff is stretched to be equal to the shirt. I definitely don't want to be stretching the shirt or I'll end up with a wavy result. And I use these 2 fingers here, like next to the needle, or sorry, next to the foot. And that helps me guide it. Like I'm not pushing or pulling, I'm just making sure that it's not moving this way by keeping this as a marker. So can you see I'm not really trimming anything off. Just little fluffs are getting trimmed off. Okay, I'm approaching my first pin, making sure nothing is wrinkled. Pull that out. And I always make sure my needles are down while I'm fidgeting with anything that involves kind of pulling. Okay, so we're going to be cutting off this thread with the knife. Make sure my needle's down so I can readjust. See, I'm trimming off a tiny bit because it's just a little bit rolled. There it goes. Needle down because I want to pull a little. And I have my fingers here. Okay, so it's a little bit more loose than I wanted, so I'm going to pull this out prematurely so that I can use this to pull it straight. And you can see here that it didn't quite catch this front layer that much, but that's okay because I'm going over it as I get back to the beginning point. And I'm remembering that I'm keeping these going opposite directions. I ended up trimming off a little more over here. It's a little thicker, but that's okay. Okay, so as I'm coming back around the front, I am going to be trimming off a little bit right here to make sure that I have that smooth line. I want to make sure I have these out of the way and they don't get sucked in and then tacked down. Okay, so what I do when I get here, I raise my needle so that my knife is raised so I can disengage the knife to exit off. More experienced sewists don't need to do that, but for me, it's helpful. And I'm just watching that it's lined up. Once it has encapsulated the area that I trimmed, then I'm gonna try to go off at as sharp of an angle as I can. And then I put my knife back down now so I don't forget later. All right, so I'm happy with that. And I will use a crochet hook to tuck that in. So there's my cuff. I hope that was helpful. Here's my finished shirt with all the cuffs and neckband attached. I did the bottom band the same way as the wrist cuffs, and I lined up this side seam here, and I got pretty close on this one as well. Not perfect. And then I used my crochet hook to tuck in the tail right here. I used to trim it and tie a knot, or tie a knot and then trim it, but I find this just looks a little neater, and I use this little crochet hook for that. So the main takeaway here is that you can go as slow as you need when you're on the serger. Just make sure the needle is down so that you can stretch and make sure all the layers are lined up nicely, and you don't need to trim off much, but if you do, it helps keep it neat instead of rolling over. Thanks so much to Sue MM for asking the question, and please like this video if it's helpful, subscribe to my channel, and let me know anything else you'd like to see. Happy sewing!